Few chapters in human history are as horrifying as the story of World War II. It was the largest conflict the world had ever seen, with the death of over 75 million people in 6 years. However, World War II includes countless stories of the courage and sacrifice from free men who resisted evil and tyranny. Many of them went even beyond the call of duty, for which the United States repaid them with the highest honor of all, the Medal of Honor. Among 473 recipients, you'll find people from all regions of America and all social classes. But what you may find interesting is that among dozens of Johns, Williams, Roberts, and James, you'll also find names such as Frank Ono, Joe and Shizuya Hayashi, Yukio Okutsu, or Kazuo Otani. These are the names of Japanese Americans. They not only fought alongside other Americans in the war, but belonged to the most decorated unit of the war. They fought bravely for the pride of their country and their community. This is the story of the deadly Nisei warriors. The Japanese community in America began to develop in the second half of the 19th century with the first large-scale wave of Japanese immigration. By the 1940s, estimates were that some 285,000 people of Japanese descent were living in the United States. Of these numbers, slightly more than half lived on the Hawaii Islands, while the rest settled mostly on the West Coast. The majority of this population were the so-called Nisei, or second-generation Japanese Americans, people born in America with full citizenship. They were mostly bilingual, speaking both English and Japanese, and often straddled the cultural expectations of both American society and their Japanese households. However, after the Pearl Harbor attack, their sense of belonging to American society was put to a serious test. Many Americans questioned the loyalty of citizens with Japanese ancestry, which led to widespread distrust toward the community. The U.S. government, under pressure to assess and control potential threats, categorized all Japanese Americans as enemy aliens. The Executive Order 9066 forced nearly 112,000 West Coast Nisei and their families into internment camps. Overnight, they were transformed from loyal citizens into the enemies of the state. In Hawaii, the anti-Japanese sentiment was even stronger, but the internment policy was never implemented because the American Japanese made up 1/3 of the island's population. What's more, the Japanese were allowed to continue to serve in the Hawaii National Guard. When the war started in 1941, most Nisei were young adults and teenagers eager to prove their loyalty to the USA. Recognizing their willingness to serve, the military decided to form a segregated unit of Japanese American soldiers. Thus, the 100th Infantry Battalion was formed. It was the so-called Bastard Battalion, as it was not attached to any of the existing regiments. From Hawaii, soldiers of the 100th Battalion were sent to Camp McCoy in Wisconsin. The cold weather was a shock for the men accustomed to the warm climate, especially because they had to live in tents for the first few months. Unfortunately, the weather was not the only problem. Nisei soldiers felt lonesome, far from their homes, and faced suspicion from the locals. Some people couldn't understand why men who looked Japanese wore U.S. Army uniforms, especially during the war with Japan. One day, an old farmer even thought they were Japanese invaders and rushed to tell the police. However, as time passed, the locals began to warm up. Their hearts were won by the politeness shown by the American Japanese soldiers. Locals were particularly impressed with how soldiers paid respect to the elders. They began to communicate with them and even call them to their houses for dinners. The Army as well didn't know how to treat soldiers of the 100th Battalion. Even though they wore American uniforms and swore allegiance to the American flag, they were much different from other soldiers. They called themselves One Puka Puka, as in Hawaiian Pidgin English, puka stands for whole. The nickname soon became widely accepted. Because of outstanding dedication during training, the American Japanese soldiers soon won the trust and respect of everyone in the camp. The training was extremely tough, but men worked hard to prove themselves as loyal Americans. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Farron Turner, constantly reminded them that their family's future depended on their performance. However, not everyone was glad to serve alongside them. Some Texan soldiers from the 2nd Division didn't like seeing Japanese Americans in U.S. Army uniforms and insulted them. Soldiers of 1 Puka Puka, though smaller in size, stood their ground. Despite being outnumbered, they handled themselves well, further gaining respect from their peers. When they were transferred to Camp Shelby in Mississippi, men trained harder than ever. Their small size didn't stop them from excelling in difficult tasks. What's more, they were completing exercises more quickly than average soldiers. During exercises in Louisiana, they dealt with swampy, hot conditions. They got through it all, knowing that their service wasn't just about winning battles, it was about gaining respect for their community back home. It was precisely their effort that helped sway the authorities to reconsider their stance on Japanese American soldiers. In early 1943, President Franklin Roosevelt formally announced the creation of a Japanese American combat team. This new 442nd Infantry Regimental Combat Team included volunteers from both Hawaii and mainland America, many of whom were interned in camps. The government's intentions were clear: to demonstrate that all citizens, regardless of ancestry, were equal in their rights and duties, and to counter Japanese propaganda, which claimed the U.S. waged a race war. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Charles W. Pence, was officially activated February 1, 1943 at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, and included the 442nd Infantry Regiment, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Infantry Battalions, 522nd Field Artillery Battalion, and the 232nd Combat Engineer Company. During months of rigorous training, the 442nd lived up to the reputation built by the 100th Battalion. They continually sent replacements to the 100th Infantry Battalion, which had been deployed to Italy in August of 1943. It was in this theater of war that the men of 1 Puka Puka would enter the legend. The 100th Battalion landed at Oran, North Africa in September of 1943. Over there, the Japanese American soldiers faced tough conditions, regular sandstorms and biting insects. But the worst was the isolation of being an orphan battalion without assignment. Determined to prove themselves, 1 Puka Puka commanders sought active duty instead of being stationed for guard duty. They refused safer roles that kept them away from the front lines. The unit was then attached to the 133rd Infantry Regiment of the 34th Division, a seasoned National Guard unit from the Midwest known as the Red Bulls. It was a significant step for the 100th Battalion, as it allowed them to gain the respect of other units and dispel widespread doubts about their loyalty. The funny thing is, they did win the sympathies of the regiment, but in a rather unusual way, by playing baseball. It was because of their team, the Aloha team, won the North Africa Baseball Championship and brought the trophy to the Red Bulls. This seemingly small victory not only boosted the troops' morale, but also helped the white soldiers to recognize their Japanese-American comrades as friends and teammates. As part of the 133rd, the 100th Battalion landed at Salerno, Italy on September 22, 1943. The first few days in the enemy country put to test men's courage and morale as they had to adjust to the sounds and sights of a war zone. Each soldier faced fears and wondered what their first experience of combat would be like. They didn't have to wait long to find out. On September 29th, as the unit marched from Montemarano towards Chiusano in heavy rain and through mud-soaked roads, it was caught off guard by German forces. Explosions shook the ground. Artillery shells burst around the battalion, forcing soldiers to dive for cover. In the chaos, Sergeant Joe Takata took the lead, trying to locate the enemy's position. He moved to the front of his squad, exposing himself to gunfire. Just as he advanced, an artillery shell struck him. He became the first rifle-carrying Japanese-American to die in combat. Lieutenant Young-Ok Kim, who was at the rear of Company B, was one of the first to recover from the initial shock of the ambush. He quickly organized his platoon to respond to the attack. He carefully led his men up the hill, moving from cover to cover. Kim's calm under pressure and careful orders helped keep the rest of the battalion together under intense enemy fire. At one point, the company commander ordered Kim to advance directly up the main road, a route that would have exposed his platoon to enemy fire from the German forces concealed along the hills. Kim, aware of the danger and familiar with the terrain from a glance at a map, immediately saw that following the road would lead his men straight into a deadly trap. Kim refused the order and instead directed his platoon to take a flanking route. His decision put him at odds with his commander, who, frustrated by Kim's defiance, insisted that Kim follow orders. Kim held his ground, and it paid off. By avoiding the main road and using the natural cover provided by the rugged terrain, the platoon successfully maneuvered around enemy positions, sparing them from a probable ambush. His willingness to challenge orders that endangered his soldiers earned him the trust and respect of his men. As the troops moved inland, Kim's leadership earned him a legendary status. On November 3rd, the battalion was ordered to cross the freezing Volturno River, but only to find itself surrounded by a minefield. Kim's company commander, who initially had been skeptical of Kim's navigation skills, insists that they follow a different path than the one Kim suggested. It led the platoon directly into the heart of the minefield, where many soldiers lost their lives. The company commander quickly realized the danger and reluctantly asked Kim to take charge again. With precise memory of the terrain map he had only briefly reviewed earlier, Kim led his men back to the safer path he had identified. Slowly and methodically, he guided his platoon, marking a safe route among the mines and avoiding more potential casualties. On another occasion, he ordered his platoon to hide along a narrow mountain path and let the German column pass. He could have ordered his men to attack, but instead chose to wait, avoiding unnecessary casualties. This didn't mean Kim was afraid of fighting. It was far from it. He knew no fear and never wore a helmet in combat. He simply opted to save his men from unnecessary risks. Such decisions won him great respect among the men, who began calling him Samurai Kim. But it was not only Lieutenant Kim who proved his worth in the early days of the Italian campaign. The entire 100th Battalion's persistence in combat won them hard-earned respect from Allied commanders and soldiers alike. Even when they faced fatigue, hunger, and injuries, they showed relentless determination as they pushed enemy troops through southern Italy. Then came January of 1944 and the Battle of Monte Casino, the moment that would shape the battalion's destiny. Monte Casino was a key strategic position in the Gustav Line, an elaborate system of G fortifications spanning from coast to coast in southern Italy. It was the last Axis stronghold before the Italian capital, the city of Rome. In January 1944, Allied troops launched a massive operation against the formidable German positions in the area. As part of the U.S. Army II Corps, the 100th Battalion was to take an important part in one of the fiercest battles in World War II. Their task was to move across the flooded Rapido Valley and try to approach the Germans from the north. The problem was the German forces had placed artillery and machine guns and mortars across the mountainous area, making it nearly impossible for any troops to approach without getting spotted and fired upon. On January 24, 1944, the battalion was ordered to advance across a muddy flatland toward the Rapido River. The river, flooded by the Germans to create a natural barrier, forced the soldiers to wade through knee-deep mud while avoiding mines. As they advanced, the soldiers faced devastating machine gun fire from German positions on the ridge. Despite the fierce enemy resistance, Company A and Company C managed to reach the dike on the eastern side of the Rapido River by dawn. When Company B received orders to join them, Battalion Commander Major Caspar Klo refused, knowing that the daylight advance across open ground would mean certain death for his men. Despite repeated orders from Colonel Marshall, the regimental commander, Klo held his position, unwilling to risk unnecessary lives. His refusal led to him being relieved of his command. However, his replacement, Major George Dewey, came to the same conclusion. Determined to verify the situation firsthand, Dewey moved forward with his executive officer, Jack Johnson. Along the way, they triggered a mine explosion that injured Dewey and mortally wounded Johnson. Major Klo was reinstalled as battalion commander. On January 26, Company B received a new order to advance to the dike occupied by Companies A and C. This time, men were to be protected by a smokescreen. However, as the troops moved across the open field, a strong wind blew away the screen and fully exposed the soldiers to a barrage of German artillery. It was a terrible scene with shells and mines exploding all over the place. In the end, out of the entire company, only 11 soldiers broke through this hell and reached the dike. The same moment they arrived, orders came for all three companies to retreat. Defeated, the battalion pulled back to reserve positions, with fewer than half the original 1,300 soldiers remaining fit for duty. On February 8th, the battalion returned to the battle, this time on Castle Hill, a key position controlling the road to Monte Casino. Here as well, German soldiers were entrenched in positions where they could see any movement on the hill. The situation was so dire that the troops couldn't even get out of their foxholes to attend to their basic needs. Yet the 100th Battalion remained on the hill for 4 days and 3 nights, fighting desperately to break through. Unfortunately for Allied troops, the German position at Monte Casino remained strong. On February 15th, the Allies launched a massive bombing campaign, dropping thousands of tons of bombs on the town and the abbey on the hill. The bombardment reduced the town to rubble, creating more cover for German soldiers who continued to defend their position from the ruins. The battle dragged on through the winter and into spring. It wasn't until late May that Allied forces finally broke through, with British and Polish troops capturing the town and monastery. The one Pukapuka's part in the battle was remembered as one of courage and determination despite overwhelming odds, with the soldiers enduring extreme conditions and severe losses, for which they earned the unofficial nickname Purple Heart Battalion. After the well-deserved rest, the battered 100th Battalion was attached to the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which arrived in Naples May 28, 1944. They were to replace the missing 1st Battalion, but were allowed to retain their designation because of the previous combat history and respect gained. In the following period, the unit continued its Italian campaign by advancing along the west coast of the Italian peninsula toward the city of Livorno. On the hills above the city, German forces made their last stand, defending this crucial port. During the operation to conquer the city, the 442nd Infantry Regiment coordinated its attacks with the 552nd Field Artillery Battalion, where engineers from the 232nd Engineer Company worked diligently to keep supply roads accessible. The battle for Livorno lasted from July 16th to the 18th. The Germans held their ground vigorously but eventually lost the battle. Liberating Livorno granted the Allies access to a vital port for future operations in Italy. After Livorno, the 442nd Combat Group moved to the rear for the rest. Their campaign in Italy concluded in September 1944, with the crossing of the Arno River advancing toward the Gothic Line. At the end of September, the entire combat group moved to the Naples region, where on September 26th, they boarded Coast Guard transports and set sail for France. The 442nd Regiment landed at Marseille, where they joined the 36th Division, also known as the Texas Division, which had recently suffered severe losses. Moving north, the regiment traveled along the Rhone River and entered the Vosges Mountains, swarming with German presence. As the 442nd advanced through the forest, they faced intense resistance. The dense Vosges forest was full of hidden German positions, machine guns, and mines, making every step dangerous. Danger lurked even from above. The so-called tree bursts from artillery shells that struck tall pines would scatter deadly shrapnel and splinters over the troops. To make things worse, soldiers battled through cold rain, mud, and harsh forest terrain. In mid-October, the regiment was assigned to liberate the town of Bruyères, which had been occupied by German forces for 4 years. By October 18th, the regiment reached Bruyères, moving cautiously from house to house to clear out enemy soldiers. Civilians who spent the last few weeks in cellars emerged from hiding as Japanese-American soldiers entered the town. The citizens of Bruyères were initially surprised and curious to see Japanese-American soldiers. The townspeople had rarely, if ever, seen soldiers of Japanese descent, and their presence was unexpected. Some civilians were initially unsure, but this turned to relief as they recognized the soldiers as their liberators. The soldiers handed out chocolate and bread, which left a lasting, heartwarming impression on the children, who hadn't tasted such treats during the years of occupation. However, these were only brief moments of joy as the 442nd continued its advance through the Vosges Mountains. In late October, they received news of the Lost Battalion. Lost Battalion was a unit from the 141st Regiment comprised mostly of men from Texas who found themselves trapped behind enemy lines. Surrounded by German forces in the dense and challenging Vosges Mountains in France, the men of the Lost Battalion faced severe shortages of food, water, and medical supplies. Their position was grim, but they managed to hold their ground despite constant attacks. One of the units ordered to run to their rescue was the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Although they were battle-hardened soldiers, reaching the lost battalion was a challenge even for them. They had to advance through steep, muddy terrain crisscrossed with minefields and German machine gun nests and dugouts. A much bigger problem was that of all the units ordered to rescue the lost battalion, the 442nd was the only one willing to actually do it. As its soldiers encountered the enemy in the forest and suffered the first casualties, they felt that they were the only ones risking their lives to save the trapped men. Nevertheless, they kept pushing forward, driven by a sense of duty and comradeship. Such high combat morale came at a price, though. Casualties were piling up among the 442nd, but they simply couldn't break through German defenses. Then, after 2 days of severe fighting on October 29th, word came that the lost battalion was on the verge of a breakdown. Had they not been saved within hours, they would have faced annihilation. Lieutenant Edward Davis, the last remaining officer in Company K, decided at that point to go with the regiment's motto, "Go for broke." Wage everything on one roll. Despite suffering from severe stomach pain due to cold rations and near dysentery conditions in the wet, cold forest, he called on his sergeant, Etchan Kohashi, to follow him in this bonsai charge. Kohashi joyfully accepted and charged with a loud battle cry that spurred other soldiers to join. The Germans were stunned by the image of soldiers running from one tree to another through the hail of machine gun bullets and explosions. Soldiers of the 442nd went berserk. They were shooting at everything, even swaying branches. For many of them, the charge was a personal matter, revenge for their fallen comrades. They felt nothing but rage as they pushed forward despite their injuries. At one point, soldiers scrambled into enemy dugouts and started killing enemies from close range, including those who wanted to surrender. Halfway up the hill, Company I joined the charge. In little more than an hour, soldiers of these two companies managed to achieve what the entire regiment failed to do in 2 previous days. They were on top of the hill overlooking the position of the lost battalion. On the morning of October 30th, a new charge was launched on the last German positions before the lost battalion. The first to reach them were men of the 1st and 2nd platoons of Company I. At that moment, due to heavy casualties, both platoons numbered only 8 men. When they arrived, the soldiers of the 141st were overcome with relief, some even embracing their rescuers. However, the 442nd's fight wasn't over. Almost immediately, they were ordered to take another position on a nearby hill, pushing them even further into harm's way. The fighting continued for several more days, with more casualties adding to the heavy toll on the regiment. Many of the soldiers struggled with exhaustion and injuries, but they pressed on. After the rescue, the soldiers' emotional and physical toll became clear. Battle fatigue, lack of sleep, and high casualty rates left them mentally and physically drained. The casualty aftermath was somber for the 442nd. The regiment had entered the Vosges Mountains with around 2,943 men. By the end, it lost over 2/3 of its strength, with hundreds of soldiers killed